Imagine a world where justice doesn't come easy, where the fight for what's right is often overshadowed by power and corruption. Now, imagine a team unlike any other one, made up of two unlikely partners who will stop at nothing to expose the truth and bring those responsible to justice. This is the story of a human and their dog, a bond that transcends ordinary companionship, and a mission to change everything. At first glance, you might not think much of this team. It's just a person and their loyal dog, right? But there's more to this story than meets the eye. The human is someone who's seen the darker side of life, someone who's been pushed to their limits, yet refuses to back down. They've witnessed injustices, things that no one should ever experience, and now, they are on a quest to make things right. They've learned that sometimes, the fight for justice isn't about having the most resources or the loudest voice. Sometimes, it's about having the courage to stand up and take action, no matter how overwhelming the odds. And by their side, standing tall and unwavering, is a dog whose loyalty and instincts go beyond simple companionship. This dog isn't just a pet. They're a partner in every sense of the word. With a sharp nose for trouble and an unshakable determination to protect, the dog is more than just a sidekick. In fact, it's their extraordinary abilities that will prove to be the game changer in this fight for justice. Together, they form a bond so powerful, it will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the limits of teamwork and trust. But the journey won't be easy. Along the way, they'll face obstacles that threaten to tear them apart, and enemies who will stop at nothing to see them fail. Each step they take brings them closer to uncovering a massive conspiracy, one that could shake the very foundation of everything they believe in. The stakes are high, and the danger is real. But despite the risks, they are determined to fight for what's right. Because they know that in the end, justice is worth fighting for, no matter the cost. But just when they think they're getting close to the truth, something unexpected happens. An unforeseen twist, a betrayal they never saw coming. Everything they've worked for could crumble in an instant. As the tension builds and the story unfolds, one thing becomes clear: the path to justice is far more complicated than they could have ever imagined. With each new challenge, they learn something about themselves, about the world they're fighting to change, and about the incredible power of teamwork between a person and their dog. The question remains: can they overcome the odds stacked against them, or will the shadows of corruption swallow their efforts whole? The battle for justice has only just begun, and the outcome is uncertain. What will happen next? Stay tuned, because this story is far from over, and what happens next might change everything. The city was a quiet one, but beneath its calm surface, there was a deep undercurrent of unrest. People went about their daily routines, working in offices, running small businesses, raising families, but all the while, a darkness lingered in the background, like a shadow that wouldn't go away. Some people knew about it, but most chose to ignore it. After all, it didn't directly affect them, did it? That's how the injustice spread. Slowly, methodically, until it became too big to ignore. The quiet people, the ones who always kept their heads down, began to notice the cracks in the system. They noticed how the truth was being buried, how powerful figures were making decisions that hurt those who had no voice. But by the time they started to see it, it was already too late. Or so they thought. For one person, however, it wasn't too late. They had always been a fighter, even when life had dealt them a harsh hand. They had seen the ugliness of the world up close. But rather than let it defeat them, it made them stronger. They knew what it meant to struggle, to fight for survival, and that gave them the determination to fight for others who had no one to stand up for them. It wasn't just the human spirit that kept them going, though. The dog, their constant companion, was just as much a part of the journey. There was something remarkable about the way the dog seemed to understand what was at stake. It wasn't just loyalty, it was something deeper, something primal. When danger approached, the dog was always the first to sense it, always the first to act. And every time, the dog's instincts proved to be right. They had met under strange circumstances, the human and the dog. The dog had been abandoned, left to fend for itself in a city where survival was anything but guaranteed. The human had found the dog, starving and weak, huddled in an alley. At that moment, they'd both been lost, both fighting to stay afloat in a world that seemed to care little for those who fell through the cracks. The dog had been hesitant at first, wary of trust, but over time, the bond between them had grown stronger. They shared something unspoken, a mutual understanding of the harshness of the world and the need to fight back. It was as if they had both found a partner who truly understood them, without judgment, without hesitation. And so, they became a team, a force to be reckoned with. But despite all their determination, they had no idea just how deep the conspiracy went. They were starting to uncover pieces of a much larger puzzle, and with every discovery, the danger they faced grew. The people behind this were powerful, untouchable. They controlled much of the city's politics, its economy, and even the media. Their influence was everywhere, and it seemed impossible to fight against. The deeper the human and their dog dug, the more they realized that they were up against something far more dangerous than they had imagined. And yet they couldn't stop. The stakes were too high. They had to push forward. Every new piece of evidence they uncovered only fueled their determination to bring the truth to light. But with every step, they felt the weight of the danger closing in on them. They weren't just fighting for justice, they were fighting for their lives. The people they were up against weren't afraid to eliminate threats, and the human knew they were being watched. The dog, as always, was the first to sense something was wrong. It was late one evening when the first real sign of danger appeared. The human had just left a meeting with an informant, someone who had agreed to help, but only on the condition of secrecy. The informant had promised to deliver documents that could expose the corruption at the heart of the city. It was the breakthrough they had been waiting for, and the human felt a sense of hope that they might finally be able to take down the people who had caused so much harm. But as they walked down the darkened street toward their car, the dog suddenly froze. It was as if something had snapped inside the dog's mind, a shift that couldn't be ignored. The human turned, sensing the change in the air. Something was off. Before they could react, a van screeched to a halt nearby, blocking the path. The doors opened, and several men in dark clothing stepped out. The human's heart raced, and the dog immediately moved into a defensive stance, growling low and deep, warning the approaching strangers. The human's mind raced. They knew these men had seen them in passing at the higher echelons of the city's political and business circles. These were not just ordinary thugs. These were people with connections, people who wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to keep their secrets safe. One of the men stepped forward, a smirk on his face. "I'd suggest you stop right there," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You've been digging in places you shouldn't. I'm afraid that's going to cost you." The human's mind raced for a solution. They had to think fast. They couldn't afford to get caught now, not when they were so close. And they certainly couldn't afford to let the dog get hurt. The dog, however, wasn't waiting for orders. With a sudden burst of speed, the dog lunged at the closest man, knocking him off balance and sending him crashing to the ground. The others immediately moved to restrain the dog, but it was too fast, too strong. The human didn't hesitate. They grabbed the nearby metal rod that had been left against the fence and swung it at one of the men, knocking him back. The confrontation escalated quickly, and it was clear that they were outnumbered. The human knew they had to get away. They had to survive this encounter, no matter what. But just as it seemed they might break free, another van arrived. This one was different, sleek, black, and clearly designed for high-end operations. The door opened, and out stepped someone far more dangerous than anyone they had encountered so far. The human's stomach dropped. This was the person they had been dreading, a figure so powerful and influential that the entire city seemed to bow at their feet. The dog growled fiercely, sensing the danger, but the human could see the fear in the animal's eyes. This wasn't a fight they could win, not tonight. They needed to get out. They needed to live to fight another day. With one last desperate glance at the man who had just stepped out of the van, the human grabbed the dog by the collar and made a break for it. They ran, faster than they had ever run before, adrenaline coursing through their veins. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them, but the human refused to look back. They had no choice but to keep running. As they turned the corner and disappeared into the shadows of the city's backstreets, the dog's ears perked up, and they both knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The fight had only just begun, and now they had more enemies than ever before. The danger was closing in, and the human knew they couldn't keep running forever. But where could they go next? What would it take to finally expose the truth and bring justice to the city? The pieces of the puzzle were still scattered, and the path forward seemed more uncertain than ever. And so, as the night continued to fall around them, they disappeared into the darkness, knowing one thing for sure: the fight for justice wasn't just about uncovering secrets, it was about surviving long enough to see those secrets exposed. The story wasn't over, not yet. But every step they took, every risk they took, brought them closer to the truth and to the people who would stop at nothing to keep it buried. The cold night air cut through the streets, biting at their skin as they ran. The human's heart pounded in their chest, the rhythm of their breath growing erratic, as if their body knew the danger wasn't over, that it was only beginning. The dog was by their side, its paws barely making a sound on the pavement as they moved, instinctively guiding them through the alleyways, away from the van, away from the danger that was closing in. The world around them seemed to shrink with every step they took, the buildings towering like silent witnesses to their flight. They finally slowed, their backs pressed against the cold, graffiti-covered walls of a forgotten part of the city. The dog, still alert, sniffed the air and glanced over its shoulder, sensing that the chase had ended for now. The human leaned against the wall, trying to catch their breath. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. The faces of the men in dark clothes, the mysterious figure who had stepped out of the black van, it all replayed in their mind like a nightmare. They had barely escaped, and they knew it wasn't a matter of if they'd be found, but when. They couldn't stay hidden forever. The deeper they dug into the city's corruption, the more dangerous it became. There were far more powerful people involved than they'd ever imagined, people who had spent years burying their secrets beneath layers of lies and manipulation. The human's mind flickered to the document they had nearly gotten their hands on, the one that could expose everything. It was still out there, in the hands of someone who knew how to stay hidden. The informant who had promised them the truth had disappeared without a trace, and now they were left with nothing but a growing sense of dread. How could they continue when it felt like the walls were closing in, when they couldn't trust anyone? The dog nudged their hand, as if sensing their thoughts. The human reached down and stroked the dog's head, grateful for the comfort, the silent reassurance that the bond between them was unbreakable. But even the dog couldn't shield them from the truth. The stakes were higher than ever, and the danger wasn't just physical. It was systemic. They weren't just up against thugs in the streets. They were up against a machine, a network of corrupt officials, shady business tycoons, and untouchable elites, all working together to protect a secret that could change everything. The deeper the human went, the more it felt like they were uncovering a web that stretched farther than they had imagined. They knew they had to keep going, but where could they turn? They couldn't go back to the safe house they had already been compromised. They couldn't trust the few allies they had left, not with the risk of being exposed. The human's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise in the distance: footsteps. The sound was distant, but it was enough to make the dog's ears prick up. It was enough to make the human's heart race again. "We need to move," they whispered, more to themselves than to the dog. The night had turned into a game of cat and mouse, and they weren't sure how much longer they could stay one step ahead. They moved again, slipping through the shadows, avoiding the main roads, sticking to the underbelly of the city. The streets grew quieter as they ventured deeper into unfamiliar parts of town. It wasn't safe here either, but at least the scent of danger wasn't as strong. As they passed abandoned buildings and broken streetlights, the human couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though no one seemed to be around. Then it happened. A phone call. The human's phone vibrated in their pocket, breaking the silence with an almost deafening hum. They froze, looking around for any sign of danger. The call had been set to private, no number, just a blocked ID. A cold chill ran down their spine. Was it them? Had the people they were up against found them already? With trembling fingers, they answered. "Don't trust anyone," a voice whispered, low and urgent. "They're all watching you. You're in more danger than you realize." Before they could respond, the line went dead. The human stood there, staring at the screen in disbelief. The words echoed in their mind. "You're in more danger than you realize." It was almost as if someone had been watching their every move. Had they been set up? Was there a mole among their few allies, feeding information to those who wanted them silenced? The human's thoughts spun out of control, but one thing was clear: they couldn't trust anyone, not anymore. Not even the people who had once seemed like allies. The game had changed, and they were alone in a city full of enemies. The dog, sensing their distress, nuzzled against them, offering comfort that, in that moment, felt almost too little, too late. They couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. As they pressed on, they stumbled upon a small diner tucked away between two narrow alleys. The neon sign flickered faintly in the distance, casting an eerie glow. It was the kind of place that seemed abandoned most of the time, only open late for those who had nowhere else to go. The human hesitated for a moment, then pulled the door open, stepping inside. The diner was empty except for the woman behind the counter. She was older, her face lined with years of hard living, but her eyes were sharp, assessing. She looked up as the human entered, then nodded toward an empty booth. "You look like you need a place to sit. Drink?" The human didn't answer right away. The sense of unease still gnawed at them. There was something about the woman's calm demeanor that didn't sit right. Was she another ally? Or was this another trap? "I just need to think for a moment," the human replied, their voice low, weary. They slid into the booth, their eyes never leaving the woman as she moved behind the counter. The dog settled at their feet, its ears still alert, eyes scanning the room. The human tried to push the doubt from their mind, but it was hard. Everywhere they turned, it seemed like there was something else to fear, another layer of deception to peel back. They needed answers, needed to know who could be trusted. As the woman brought over a cup of coffee, the human reached into their jacket pocket and pulled out a small slip of paper, the last piece of the puzzle they had been trying to put together. A name. A contact. Someone who could potentially offer the missing piece of information that would bring everything to light. But just as the human was about to tuck the paper back into their pocket, a figure appeared in the doorway. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a dark coat that seemed to blend into the shadows. The man stepped forward, his eyes locked onto the human with a cold intensity. "I think you've been looking for me," the man said, his voice low and calculated. The woman behind the counter didn't even blink, as if this was an everyday occurrence. The dog growled under the table, its hackles raised. The human's heart skipped a beat. This was at the moment they had been dreading. The danger was here, and the questions were only growing louder. Who was this man? What did he know? And what would he do next? The tension was unbearable, the answers just out of reach. And as the man stepped closer, the human realized they were standing on the edge of something far bigger than they had ever imagined. The story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The man stood in the doorway, his presence commanding, his eyes cold and calculating. Every step he took toward the table felt like a countdown, each one heavier than the last. The human's pulse quickened, and they instinctively gripped the edge of the table, as if that small motion could somehow ground them. But nothing about this situation felt grounded. Everything about it felt like the earth was shaking beneath their feet. The woman behind the counter didn't flinch, didn't even seem to acknowledge the man's presence, which only deepened the human's suspicion. Was she in on this too? Or had she simply learned how to survive in a city where everyone was playing their own game? The dog, still growling low, stayed close, its body tense, ready to act. It was clear that the man in front of them wasn't just another player in the web of corruption. He was someone with power, someone who could decide whether the human walked out of that diner or didn't. "I think you've been looking for me," the man repeated, his voice now sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. He took another step forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the human. His gaze flicked down to the slip of paper, still clutched in the human's hand. The tension was so thick, it felt like the air itself had become suffocating. The human's mind raced. This was the moment when everything they had worked for would either crumble or ignite into something far bigger. The man knew something. He had to. But how much? And what would it cost to learn the truth? "Who are you?" The words slipped out before the human could stop them, their voice betraying the nervousness they felt inside. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied them for a long, uncomfortable moment, his eyes lingering on the human's face, as though weighing every move. It was like he was deciding something that could change everything. "I'm someone who's very interested in what you're doing," he said finally, his tone measured, but the threat hanging in the air was unmistakable. "And I'm someone who can make all of this go away if you cooperate." The human's heart skipped. Could this be the end? Was this man another player trying to control the situation, to silence them before they could expose the truth? Or was there something more to his words, something that could give them the edge they so desperately needed? Before they could respond, the man took another step, his shadow falling over the table. The dog, sensing the growing danger, stood up, its growl growing louder. The human's hand tightened around the paper in their pocket. They had to be careful. They couldn't be too quick to trust anyone, not even this man who claimed to have all the answers. But the alternative? The human didn't want to even think about it. "You don't get it, do you?" The man's voice dropped lower, almost a whisper, though his words carried a deadly weight. "There are things you don't know. People you don't understand. This fight you're picking? It's bigger than you. You have no idea what you're dealing with." The words hung in the air, suffocating. The human's mind buzzed. Bigger than me? They had already uncovered so much, risked so much. How could it be bigger than this? "I'm offering you a way out," the man continued, his gaze unwavering. "But you have to make a choice right now. You can either keep digging and risk everything, or you can walk away from this. I'll make sure you and your dog here walk away unharmed. That's the best deal you'll get." The human's grip on the table tightened as they tried to process the offer. It was tempting. The stakes were getting higher every second. Maybe the man was right. Maybe they didn't fully understand what they were up against, and the cost of continuing might be too high. But then, as if by instinct, their eyes locked on the dog, its unwavering loyalty, its readiness to fight, to protect. It wasn't just a pet. It was a partner. And the human realized, with a sudden clarity, that they couldn't back down now, not when the truth was so close, not when so many people had already been hurt by this system. "No deal," the human finally said, their voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside. "I'm not walking away. Not until I have answers." The man's expression didn't change, but the tension in the room shifted. It was subtle, but it was there. Something was about to break. The man's eyes narrowed as he tilted his head, his lips curling into a slight smile. It wasn't a friendly smile, though. It was the kind of smile someone gave when they were about to deliver bad news. The human braced themselves, but before the man could speak again, the door to the diner slammed open. Another figure stepped inside, a woman, tall, confident, and dressed in dark clothing that seemed to blend into the shadows. She moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the room before locking onto the man standing before the human. Without a word, she approached him, and for a moment, it seemed like time itself had slowed. The air grew heavier, the room colder, and everything felt like it was teetering on the edge of something catastrophic. "Is everything in place?" the woman asked, her voice calm but carrying an edge that sent a chill down the human's spine. The man didn't look at her. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on the human. "Almost," he replied, his voice almost too calm, too controlled. "But this one," he motioned toward the human, "isn't going to stop. They'll keep pushing. And they're getting closer to the truth." The woman's eyes flicked toward the human, and for a moment, there was a brief flicker of recognition in her gaze, an almost imperceptible shift in the way she carried herself. She knew something. "Then we need to make sure they don't get that far," she said, her voice cold as ice. The dog growled again, stepping protectively in front of the human. The tension in the diner reached a boiling point. The human's mind was racing now, every piece of the puzzle clicking into place with an unsettling clarity. These weren't just criminals. These were people who would stop at nothing to protect their empire, to crush anyone who threatened their control. The woman reached into her jacket, and for a moment, the human thought she might pull a weapon. But instead, she pulled out a small device, something the human didn't recognize. She turned it on, her finger hovering over a button. "Last chance," she said, her voice unyielding. "Walk away, and everything stays quiet. Keep fighting, and you'll regret it." The man stepped back, giving her space, but his eyes never left the human. There was something unspoken between them now, a dangerous understanding that hung in the air like a storm about to break. The human's heart pounded in their chest. The pieces were almost in place. They were on the edge of uncovering the truth, but at what cost? What would they have to sacrifice to bring justice to light? The fear, the uncertainty, it was all there, but so was something else, something stronger. A determination to see it through. To finish what they had started. But as the woman's finger hovered over the device, the human couldn't shake the feeling that this was the turning point. Everything they had done, everything they had sacrificed, was leading up to this moment. The question was no longer about what they could uncover. It was about whether they could survive long enough to expose it. The silence was deafening. The tension unbearable. And as the dog growled one last time, ready to spring into action, the human knew whatever happened next, there was no going back. The human's mind raced, their pulse quickening, as the woman's finger hovered over the device. The air in the diner was thick with tension, each second stretching into eternity. The dog growled again, more urgently this time, its ears pinned back as its eyes never left the woman's hand. The human could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them, the stakes higher than ever before. Their instinct screamed that this was it, this was the point of no return. They had to make a choice, a decision that would either expose the truth or bury it forever. But just as the woman was about to press the button, a deafening crash echoed from the street outside, followed by the roar of engines and the screech of tires. For a moment, it sounded like the ground itself had been ripped apart. The diner's neon sign flickered violently, casting erratic shadows against the walls. The human's heart skipped a beat. What the hell was happening? The man and woman both turned toward the door, their expressions shifting from calculated control to something more primal. The woman's finger hesitated, hovering over the device. Something had shifted. Something was coming. And they all knew it was big. The sound of screeching tires grew louder, followed by a deafening bang, a car crashing into something solid. The door to the diner burst open, and a group of people flooded in, their faces hidden by masks, their movements swift and purposeful. They were armed, guns raised and ready, their steps echoing through the room like a storm about to break. The human's breath caught in their throat. This was no coincidence. These people had been sent here. Sent to do what? Stop them? Kill them? But it was the man and the woman's reaction that sent a jolt of panic through the human's veins. The woman lowered the device, her face suddenly pale, her eyes wide with shock. The man, who had been so sure of himself just moments before, took a step back, his hand hovering over his own weapon as if he was trying to gauge what was happening. One of the masked figures stepped forward, his movements calm, controlled. "This is bigger than you think," he said, his voice low, but carrying an authority that couldn't be ignored. The tension in the room was suffocating now. The human's mind struggled to make sense of it all. Who were these people? What did they want? The man, who had seemed so sure of his power just moments ago, now looked almost helpless. His eyes flicked between the human, the woman, and the new arrivals, as though trying to make a decision on the fly. The human could see the fear in his eyes, a fear they hadn't expected. Had they just walked into a trap within a trap? The masked man spoke again, his words calm but chilling. "You've been digging in the wrong place," he said, his gaze locking onto the human. "The truth you're looking for isn't what you think. If you keep digging, you'll only expose yourself. And it won't be just your life on the line anymore." A chill ran down the human's spine. There was a new sense of urgency in the masked man's voice, something deeper, more dangerous. What had they uncovered? What did they know that the human didn't? The woman, still standing by the counter, finally spoke up, her voice shaking slightly. "We weren't supposed to get involved with this. But now we're all in it." She turned toward the masked group, her gaze hardening. "You need to get out. Now." One of the masked figures raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "You don't tell us what to do," he said, his tone flat. He stepped forward, and with one swift motion, grabbed the woman by the arm, pulling her towards the door. The human's eyes widened in shock. This wasn't the moment of resolution they'd expected. It was the beginning of something darker, something they couldn't have foreseen. The man who had been speaking to them earlier, his face now flushed with anger, tried to intervene. But another figure quickly stepped in, their movements too fast, too coordinated to stop. "We have what we came for," the masked man said. "You can keep playing your game, but know this, you're not the only ones searching for the truth. And there are far more dangerous people involved than you realize." Before the human could react, the figures moved again, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as they had arrived. The diner door slammed shut, and the silence that followed was deafening. The humans sat frozen, their minds scrambling to piece together what had just happened. The dog, still alert, let out a low whine, its gaze locked on the door, as though it could sense the danger lingering just outside. The human's breath was shallow as they tried to process the sudden shift in events. What had just happened? Who were those people? What did they mean by "you're not the only ones searching for the truth"? The man and woman were still there, but something had changed between them. The woman, her face pale, stepped back, as if trying to regain control of the situation. The man, however, was staring at the human with a mix of fear and urgency. "You have to get out," the man said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "They'll come for you. They'll come for both of us. And it won't stop until you've either joined them or been silenced. I told you you don't understand what you're up against." The words hit harder than any punch, and the weight of them settled in the human's chest like a lead anchor. The man was terrified, no, more than terrified. He was genuinely afraid. Whatever the human had stumbled upon, it was far worse than they'd imagined. And yet something inside them refused to back down. They had come this far. They couldn't just walk away. The stakes were too high. People's lives were on the line, and the truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. The woman, still standing by the counter, spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't know who you're really fighting," she said, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. "I didn't know at first either, but now. I can't ignore it anymore. The people who want to keep the truth hidden, they don't just control this city. They control everything. And they'll stop at nothing to make sure it stays that way." The humans stood up, their minds swirling with the weight of her words. The road ahead was more dangerous than they had ever imagined, but the truth was out there. And they were the only ones who could find it. The moment felt like a choice between survival and exposing the system, between running and fighting back. But just as the humans stepped toward the door, ready to make that decision, their phone buzzed in their pocket. They froze. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, blocked, just like before. It was the same voice from earlier, the one that had warned them. "You're not alone. You don't know who's watching. But I can help." The words cut through the chaos in their mind, and in that moment, the human realized everything was bigger than they had thought. The web they had stumbled into wasn't just about exposing a corrupt system. It was about surviving long enough to fight back. The question wasn't whether they could win, it was whether they could make it out alive long enough to uncover the full truth. And the answer to that question was still hanging in the air, just out of reach. The human's fingers tightened around the phone, the message still lingering on the screen. "You're not alone. You don't know who's watching. But I can help." It was like the final piece of the puzzle falling into place, but something about it still felt off. Who was this person? And why did they suddenly want to help now, when everything had already spiraled so far out of control? The room was still, the air thick with the tension of what had just transpired. The dog was standing beside them, its eyes darting from the door to the man and woman, waiting for any sign of danger. The human could feel the weight of every second pressing down, their mind racing to process everything that had happened, the masked figures, the warnings, the unexplained threats. And now, the message. Was this the breakthrough they'd been waiting for, or another trap? "Who was that?" the woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked almost pleading, her face drained of color. "You're in way deeper than you realize. It's too late to back out now." The human didn't answer. They couldn't. They needed to think, to figure out who was behind the message and whether they could trust them. It felt like every choice they made was leading them deeper into something they couldn't fully comprehend, something so massive that it was impossible to see the entire scope of the danger. But they couldn't stop. They had to keep moving forward. "Get out," the man repeated, his voice urgent now, more desperate. "I told you. You don't understand what you're walking into. They're everywhere. You can't fight this. It's already too late." The human didn't respond. They couldn't. There was too much at stake. Too many people who needed the truth to be exposed. The human had come too far to stop now, even if they couldn't see the way out. Then, the phone buzzed again, snapping them from their thoughts. This time, the message was clearer. "I'm not your enemy," it read. "But there's someone close to you who is. Trust no one. Not even the man who's been helping you." The human's heart skipped a beat. The words felt like a punch to the gut. Not even the man? But that didn't make sense. The man had been on their side. Hadn't he? Suddenly, a realization hit them like a freight train. They looked at the man in the diner, his face pale, his body tense, his eyes darting toward the door. He was afraid, yes, but why? Was he part of the conspiracy after all? Or was he being manipulated just as much as they were? "Who sent this?" the human asked, their voice steady despite the confusion swirling in their mind. The man hesitated, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. "I don't know," he muttered. "I swear I don't know. I told you, I'm not a part of this." But something in his voice made the human pause. There was a flicker of guilt, a flicker of hesitation. It was too late to trust him completely, not when everything they thought they knew was falling apart. The woman, who had been silent, spoke up again, her voice filled with quiet desperation. You don't get it. The people you're fighting? They control everything. They have eyes everywhere. They know what you're thinking, they know where you're going. They've been watching every move you make. And they'll stop at nothing to make sure you never find out the truth. Her words hung in the air like a death sentence, and the human couldn't help but feel the weight of them pressing down. Was it all hopeless? Were they really up against a force so powerful that no one, not even the dog, would be able to protect them? Then the man spoke again, but his voice was different now, quieter, almost broken. I didn't want this, he said, his eyes meeting the human's with a mix of guilt and fear. I didn't want you to get dragged into this mess. I didn't want you to find out. The human felt the shock settle in, the realization hitting them with the force of 1,000 bricks. You didn't know, they said, their voice barely above a whisper. You were part of it from the start. The man's face twisted in pain, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if everything had finally caught up with him. I didn't have a choice, he muttered. I was in too deep. I thought I could stop it. But once I got involved, once I started helping you, they were already watching me. Watching you? The human's mind was reeling. The truth, the whole truth, had just come crashing down in front of them. The person they had trusted, the one they thought was helping them, he was the one who had set the whole thing in motion. Before they could say anything more, the door to the diner suddenly slammed open again, this time with a force that rattled the entire building. The masked figures were back, but this time, there were more of them. More armed men, more shadows in the doorway. They moved quickly, efficiently, blocking every exit, making it clear that escape wasn't an option anymore. The human's breath caught in their throat. They had been so close to uncovering the truth. But now, it felt like the walls were closing in, the weight of everything pressing down on them. One of the masked figures stepped forward, his voice cold and sharp. We warned you. You should have stopped. You don't understand who's behind this. You never will. The human took a step back, their mind racing. What now? Was this the end? Was everything they had fought for going to vanish in an instant? But then, something unexpected happened. The dog, which had been standing perfectly still, suddenly lunged forward with a deafening bark, charging at the nearest masked figure. In that split second, the human's heart skipped, adrenaline surging through their veins. The dog was fighting back. It was willing to risk everything for the truth. And in that moment, the human understood something they hadn't fully realized until now. This wasn't just their fight. It was a fight for everyone. For every person whose life had been shattered by the same forces they were up against. The masked figures hesitated, thrown off by the sudden attack. In that brief moment of chaos, the human made their move. They ran toward the door, toward the only chance they had left. The dog was right behind them, its fierce loyalty pushing them forward as if nothing else mattered. But just as they reached the door, the phone buzzed again, the final message popping up on the screen. This time, it was different. It wasn't a warning. It was an order. You have one chance to make it out alive. Run. And don't look back. The human didn't think. They just ran. With the dog by their side, they pushed through the door and into the night, the world outside a blur of shadows and uncertainty. Behind them, the diner's door slammed shut, the echoes of footsteps fading into the distance. But the human knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The truth was still out there, buried deep beneath layers of lies and danger. And no matter what it took, they would uncover it. They would bring justice. They had to. Because now, it wasn't just about them. It was about everyone they had come to care about, everyone who had been forgotten by the system that ran everything. But even as they ran into the night, one final thought haunted them: who was watching now? The humans sprinted into the night, heart pounding in their chests, feet pounding the cold pavement as the dog kept pace beside them. The world around them felt like it was closing in, each shadow, each flicker of light a potential threat. But they had no time to stop, no time to think. The message on the phone was clear: don't look back. It was a command, not a suggestion, and they had no choice but to obey. As they rounded a corner, the sounds of pursuit began to fade, the footfalls of the masked figures trailing behind them. The streets were eerily quiet now, almost too quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The human's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. What had just happened? Who had sent that message? Why had the man in the diner betrayed them? And most pressing of all, what had they truly uncovered? The answers weren't clear yet, but the human knew one thing for certain: they couldn't stop now. They had to keep going, even if it meant running blind into the unknown. The dog barked, snapping the human out of their thoughts. It was pointing with its nose, tugging at their sleeve, urging them to move faster. The human looked up, noticing a shadow in the distance, but this time it wasn't a masked figure, it was a car, parked at the end of the street, its headlights dim but unmistakable. With a racing pulse, the human made a split-second decision. They darted toward the car, not knowing who might be inside, but realizing they didn't have the luxury of time. The dog followed closely, its senses alert. When they reached the car, the door opened, and the figure inside stepped out. It was the same voice, the one from the messages. But now, the face was familiar too. The woman from the diner. Her eyes were tired, but there was something resolute in her gaze. She didn't say anything at first, only motioned for the human to get in. The human hesitated for a moment, looking at the woman and then at the dog. It was a gamble, but it felt like their only choice. As the car pulled away, the woman finally spoke, her voice low and measured. "I know you're angry. You should be. You've been lied to, manipulated, and dragged into something much bigger than you ever thought possible." The human turned to her, their chest tightening. "I don't understand. Who are you really? What's going on?" The woman exhaled slowly, glancing over her shoulder before continuing. "The truth is, everything you've uncovered so far is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a network, a group that has been pulling the strings for years. Not just here, but all over the country. They control everything from the media to the politicians to the systems that are supposed to protect people. They've been using technology, money, and influence to keep everyone in line. And you were getting too close. So they sent the people after you to stop you. To stop anyone who got too close." The human's mind reeled at the revelation. "But the man, the one who was helping me, he's part of this too." The woman nodded, her eyes never leaving the road ahead. "He's been compromised. Just like so many others. They've infiltrated every level. No one can be trusted. But I was sent to help you, not to deceive you." "The message you received?" "It was from me." The human processed the words, trying to piece together what had happened. "So, everything? The masks, the warnings? It was all to stop me from finding out?" "Yes. They don't want anyone to know the full extent of what's going on. It's bigger than you can imagine." The car fell silent for a moment. The human felt a strange mix of anger, relief, and confusion swirling inside them. They had been so close to the truth, and now they were running from it, from the very forces they tried to expose. The road ahead was dark, the future uncertain. But they couldn't stop now. There was no turning back. "We can stop them," the woman said, her voice firm, "but only if we work together. You're not alone in this anymore. They think you're just one person, but you've got more people behind you than you realize. I'm part of a group of people who've been trying to bring down the system from the inside. But we need your help to get the final pieces of the puzzle." The human nodded, the weight of the responsibility settling onto their shoulders. "What do I need to do?" "You're going to have to go back," the woman replied, her eyes narrowing as she glanced out at the empty streets. "You're going to have to face the people who've been pulling the strings. It's the only way to end this once and for all." The human's heart raced again, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was determination. They had come too far, fought too hard, and lost too much to back down now. The next few days were a blur of planning, strategy, and information gathering. The women's group, a network of insiders who had been working to expose the truth for years, took the human under their wing. They provided resources, intel, and the support they needed to make their final move. The dog, loyal as ever, was always by their side, a constant reminder of the stakes of the battle. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, revealing the full extent of the conspiracy. The group behind it all was vast, its reach stretching into the highest levels of government, business, and media. They controlled everything, from the flow of information to the decisions that shaped the country's future. But they weren't invincible. The human had uncovered cracks in their armor, weaknesses that could be exploited. With the help of the woman's group, the human crafted a plan. It was risky, but it was the only way to take down the network once and for all. The truth had to be exposed to the world. The people had to know what was really going on. And so, in the dead of night, they made their move. The human, the woman, and a small group of trusted allies infiltrated the heart of the operation, the central hub where the puppet masters had been pulling the strings. It was guarded, fortified, but not invincible. The final showdown was brutal. The human's heart pounded as they faced off against the last remaining members of the network, the ones who had been behind the threats, the lies, and the manipulation. But with every step, they moved closer to the truth. The dog was a fierce ally, charging forward with unrelenting loyalty, making sure no one could stop them. At long last, they reached the central control room, the place where everything was being monitored, where the plans were being made. The woman's group moved quickly, disabling security systems, shutting down surveillance, and ensuring that no one could interfere. And then, the human stood before the monitors, the final piece of the puzzle. The truth was there, in black and white. All the corruption, all the deceit. The world would finally know. The next morning, the world was changed. News outlets, social media, and underground networks began broadcasting the truth. The people rose up, demanding accountability, justice, and reform. The system that had controlled them for so long began to crack, and the conspirators were exposed for all to see. The human, exhausted but proud, stood on the steps of a government building, the dog by their side. The battle wasn't over, but they had won the first round. The world was finally waking up. The woman stood beside them, her eyes filled with a mix of satisfaction and determination. "This is just the beginning," she said. "There's still a long way to go. But we've shown them what's possible. We've shown them the power of the truth." The human nodded, looking down at the dog, who wagged its tail in quiet approval. They had done it. They had taken on the system, uncovered the conspiracy, and brought the truth to light. And in doing so, they had ignited a movement, a spark that couldn't be put out. But as they looked toward the horizon, they knew this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over, but now they had the world on their side. And together, they would continue to fight for justice,